Killing days of my life was when my son's buddy came to see us. Began on a typical Saturday afternoon as the sun sank below the horizon. I was leaning against the kitchen counter, nursing a warm golden glow that was shining through my living room's windows. It was supposed to be a calm weekend, so I drank a glass of water as the evening news's gentle hum played in the background. Son Daniel was feeling particularly still as he left the house to go camping with his college pals. And suddenly, when the doorbell rang, I didn't think anyone would put down my glass, so I went to the Sebastian. Daniel's best friend was standing there when the door was opened. He remarked, "Hey, Mr. Johnson," with a pause in his dark eyes and an almost contrite stance as he welcomed me. Daniel instructed me to stop by if I needed to borrow anything for the trip, so I hope I'm not disturbing you with this bashful smile. However, I was unaware that he had already departed. Sebastian had been Daniel's friend for years, and I had witnessed his transformation from an adolescent to a self-assured, athletic young man. Sebastian always had a subtle maturity that distinguished out. He had always been courteous, and there was a warmth in his grin that made people feel comfortable. "It's no trouble," I responded, moving aside to give him space. He's the kind of buddy that any parent would want for their child. "What do you need?" He shifted his weight, appearing somewhat ashamed. Actually, I assumed Daniel would have an extra sleeping bag because I left mine at home. "He probably lets me check the garage," I said, laughing and shaking my head, urged him to follow me, and I couldn't help but observe how much he had changed since the day we headed to the garage. When I last saw him, he was taller and wider, and his shirt was tight around his body. I experienced a weird pang of awareness when I realized that he had been going to the gym on a regular basis. Immediately pushed aside, I dug through a pile of camping equipment in the garage. I gave it to him while wiping off the dust till I discovered the extra sleeping bag. I said, "Here you go. Daniel won't mind." "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," he said, grinning. He added, "Do you mind if I hang out for a—" I said, "Come on in," since I didn't want to sit in the car, and my ride wasn't arriving for another hour. Landed in the kitchen, where Sebastian reclined on the counter with his arms folded while I made a pot of coffee. Discussed his academics, summer plans, and the camping trip. He was always a considerate and approachable person, and speak in a manner that allowed discussions with him to flow naturally. But as the minutes went by, I noticed a change in the way he looked at me. When our eyes locked, he shifted closer and leaned against the counter, lingering a moment longer than required. I tried to dismiss it, chalking it up, but his presence filled the space between us. To my imagination, but as he extended his hand to take his mug, his fingertips came into contact with I felt a shock from his touch and mine. "I apologize," he muttered, pulling. I forced a laugh and added, "I'm just clumsy, but it's fine," as he swiftly returned his hand. There was a noticeable sense of tension in the room, and because there was something unsaid between us, I distracted myself with coffee. I was attempting to get rid of the weird sensation that had taken hold of my chest. Sebastian was my son's greatest buddy, or something. After saying, "I thought I was feeling it wasn't real. It couldn't be Mr. Johnson." After a long interval, his voice became softer. "May I ask you a question?" "Naturally," I murmured, turning to face him. He paused, his eyes lowering to the, "Have you ever had the feeling that you needed something you knew before meeting mine?" Ion, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. I tried to keep my tone light, but that's a fairly serious question. With a little self-conscious giggle, He ran a hand over his hair. I apologize. It seems like I've been thinking about it a lot recently. There was something honest and genuine in his tone. My chest constricted with vulnerability, and I wanted to ask him what he meant to recognize the thoughts he was having, but I wasn't sure I was prepared to hear the response. Sometimes we want things that I stated carefully, that although it's human nature, that doesn't mean we... He nodded and looked away, saying, I guess you're right, but I have to act on them. The flare of something in his eyes, and the way his lips slightly parted as though he was saying something, wanted to add more, but it made me uneasy, so I returned my attention to the coffee pot in the hopes pouring us each another cup would provide me with something to concentrate on. But I couldn't get rid of the sensation that something had changed between us, and I wasn't sure whether I could disregard it. The coffee touched us. A great weight, as the discussion became less frequent, and I could sense every little movement he made. Appeared enlarged in the calm, which wasn't unpleasant but wasn't typical either. It was charged like Sebastian sat back in his chair, stretching a little, and I felt as though something unsaid was ready to snap. I caught myself staring at him out of the corner of my eye, his shirt slightly up, exposing a muscular tanned strip of skin, and I quickly turned my head away as my face warmed up. This is absurd. I broke the stillness by asking, Are you excited about the thought? He shrugged, his lips forming a tiny smile. Yeah, I suppose, referring to the camping trip. I'm only there for the company, but Daniel truly enjoys that kind of stuff. Thus his words made me smile. That sounds like you, I mentioned, constantly watching out for him. You've been Daniel's best friend for years. Sebastian whispered, He's been a good friend to me too, as he played with the edge of his cup while looking down his fingers. Then, following a pause, he continued, You've been good to me too. And that his gentle tone and the hidden meanings underlying his statements caused my chest to constrict as I looked for hints about what he was trying to communicate on his face, but he didn't look at me. He went on. I nodded in uncertainty, since you've always made me feel accepted and like a member of the family, which is something I don't take for granted. How to react appropriately, Sebastian? You are a member of the family. At least that's how I thank you, Mr. Johnson. He grinned at that, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You may call me Sebastian. You know how the Mr. Johnson thing feels, he said, almost as an afterthought. All right, Sebastian, I laughed, but only if you stop calling me Mr. Johnson, deal? He replied, his smile growing. We moved into the living room and settled down on the couch after calming down a little in the room. The sun had already set, and the table lamp's gentle glow created cozy shadows on the Sebastian was seated at the far end of the couch in the room. His eyes were relaxed, yet centered on me. May I ask you a question? He said, following a protracted period of silence of naturally. I answered, preparing myself for yet another challenging query. Have you ever had the impression that there was anything you really wanted to say it aloud, but I scowled and stopped you? I believe that everyone feels that way at some point, I responded, guarding by the question, cautiously, but sometimes the only way to proceed is to speak it aloud. Sebastian nodded, staring at the ground. Yeah, he whispered quietly, but what if his statement that it changes everything made me shiver, but I couldn't explain why I suddenly became conscious of how close we were. I tried to maintain a constant tone, even if it was frightening, since sometimes change is a good thing with the distance between us. He looked up at first, then met my eyes. What if it's not the weight of his stare was nearly too much for me to handle, so I turned my head away, uncertain of how to handle the abrupt change in Sebastian. Didn't immediately answer when he eventually spoke. So I suppose it depends on what you're frightened of. I'm scared of ruining this, or what we have, because of the fragility in his voice, which was hardly audible above a whisper. Took me by surprise, and I felt my heart tighten. "Never mind," Sebastian replied. He instantly rose up and ran a hand through his hair, cutting me off. I probably went to my rides, and I was standing at this point. My hand reflexively closed around his arm to hold him, and he paused, staring down with wide eyes. I whispered softly, "Where we touched, you don't have to go if you don't want to." Sebastian's eyes raised to mine, and for a brief instant, neither of us made any movements. The air between us seemed electric and thick, like it was about to storm, and he took a getting closer, reducing the gap between us. "I'm not sure what I'm doing." He acknowledged that his voice was shaking, but I knew I didn't want to offend him. Like a kick to the stomach, and I experienced a wave of feelings I couldn't identify as terror. "Sebastian," I was out of breath as they all swirled together in bewilderment and need. "I know," he whispered, "but I can't help it," I said in a voice that was hardly audible. I felt a spark when he extended his hand and then brushed it against mine. Unstoppable pull that made me want to take a step back and put some gap between us, but I was unable to do so, and instead found myself leaning my heart was racing in my chest when his lips briefly touched mine. Softly and tentatively, as if he were testing the waters, he screamed at me. I tried to move away, but my body resisted, freezing me in place as the kiss intensified. The world appeared to collapse as the kiss hung in the air between us, leaving a burden I wasn't sure how to handle. Left, leaving only the two of us in the darkened living room. Sebastian's hand was hovering close to mine, and his breath was shallow. I began, as though he wasn't sure whether to move away or approach, but the words... He stepped back suddenly, raking his hand through his hair, and got hooked in my neck. "I apologize," for the weak voice he shouted out. I'm not sure what I was saying. As I tried to think of something to say, "Sebastian," my chest tightened and my heart pounded against my ribs. It's though I wasn't sure if I meant it. I managed, "So it's all right." All right. But I couldn't deny how my body reacted when I leaned into the kiss, even if he turned for a moment, pacing the room and saying, "No, it's not okay. I shouldn't have God." If Daniel knew that my son was mentioned, a chilling shock of reality would kill me. Poured over me, and even though this was completely inappropriate, our tension persisted. "Sebastian," I continued softly, attempting to steady my voice, "unquestionable and unrelenting. Need to discuss this." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his shoulders stiff. "What is there to discuss?" "I apologize." I stepped closer, my hands shaking, and I crossed a cue. I acknowledged that it's not just you. The words tasted strange to me. Yes, I sensed it too. His eyes widened, and the air between us briefly crackled. His look was troubled, as he shook his head after saying something unsaid. "Can't he state clearly that I'm Daniel's best friend, and you're his father? This shouldn't have happened." I know I said it in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, but the silence has already set in. Sebastian sat down on the couch and buried his face in his hands, suffocating. I wanted to say something, anything that could help, But in reality, I had no idea how to handle this either after what felt like. He gazed up at me for what seemed like a lifetime, his eyes brimming with a mixture of terror and desiring to know what we should do next. I sat down next to him, being mindful to give him some room. He nodded. "I don't know between us," I said, "but we need to figure it out." He said quietly, not merely, "I don't want to lose this," as his eyes fell to the ground. "Whatever this is, I don't want to destroy your friendship or your trust." I was deeply affected by everything he said, and I had a wave of remorse for placing him in this situation. Sebastian had always been like family, someone I could trust and depend on, but here we were, on the precipice of something that could ruin everything. "You won't lose me." I put a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "No matter what, we'll figure this out." He leaned in and let me touch his body, letting go a little beneath my fingers. "You mean that," he inquired, his voice full of, I said, strongly, "that I mean uncertainty, but we must exercise caution because this isn't merely about Daniel, as well as about us." When my son Sebastian was mentioned, he nodded, his phrase solemn. "You're correct." He stated that we must prevent him from learning. Destroy him. The weight of that reality descended upon us, serving as a reminder of how our circumstances were dire. But even as we sat there in quiet, hours went by, and I couldn't help but notice how my hand lingered on his shoulder and how his body appeared to lean into mine. And our conflict didn't go away. We conversed in circles, in an attempt to understanding of what had transpired and its significance, but despite our best efforts to make sense of it, the draw between us remained obvious and persistent. Sebastian seemingly did not need to depart any longer, and we spoke for hours on end. At times we touched, but neither of us did desire to, but throughout the entire evening, there was a certain amount of tension between us. Tension that, as the seconds passed, reminded me that more was on the horizon and that I wanted more, just as he did. Sebastian stood at midnight, hesitating to leave. He stated in his voice. I reluctantly stood up and followed him to the door. As he reached for the handle, he halted, turning to give me one final glance, and I murmured, "Take care of yourself." My chest tightened. "Time, you too," he said, looking into my eyes, "and I'm grateful you don't hate me." Managed to smile a little. "Sebastian, you have nothing to be angry about. Just be careful, okay?" The door closed behind him as he nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a second before he left into the night. Leaning against it, my thoughts were racing with all that had occurred and all that could occur. I knew deep down that this wasn't quite finished. The way we caressed each other and kissed each other told me I wasn't finished with him. He had sparked an emotion in me that I had never experienced at such a young age. An attractive man, I'm sure all homosexual men would like to do specific things with him, and I sensed that he was amenable to it. The days after Sebastian's visit were a haze of feelings that left me wondering how I could make this work. Untangle, I followed Russ's instructions, performed errands, and occasionally took Daniel's phone call, but my Sebastian took up all of my thoughts that evening, so I convinced myself it would. Despite the fact that this was only a brief moment of weakness, I could always see his face and hear his voice, sensed his hand's warmth, clinging to mine. Even though the weight of it all was oppressive, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Daniel was still out of town, and I wasn't expecting anyone when the knock on the door came late on a Thursday. I felt a rush of both optimism and dread as my heart leaped at the sound. When I answered the door, Sebastian was there. He murmured, "I shouldn't be here." Before I could say anything, as his fingers dug deep into his jacket pockets, I'm sure I shouldn't, but I couldn't help but stare at him while he stood there. Look that was both vulnerable and resolute left me stunned. Moved aside and silently invited him inside. He paused for a second before his presence filled the room as he crossed the threshold, making it feel both familiar and alien. I've been... He stood in the foyer, staring at the floor, reflecting on what had transpired. His words struck me like a blow to the chest, and I felt the breath leave my body. I can't stop thinking about you. Sebastian Lungs, we discussed this. It's complex, I realize it's complicated, he added rapidly, his voice shaking. And even though I know it's wrong, it doesn't alter my feelings. I'm not sure how to stop it. I wanted to let him know that I'd been feeling the same way and that he wasn't alone, but I couldn't find the right words. Rather, I extended my hand and touched his arm, causing him to recoil. However, he did not yank Sebastian away. I spoke in a whispery tone. We can't continue like this. I know. He looked again, eventually raising his head. So it's not that simple, is it? If it were, I wouldn't be here. Sincerity stripped me of whatever defenses I may have attempted to erect. I moved closer, keeping my hand on his arm. I'm not sure what you want me to say. He acknowledged that his voice was failing, but he didn't want to lose. I answered firmly, You won't, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Whatever it is, it can't go much farther. I noticed that his shoulders slumped. Ling this way, he replied quietly, as the weight of my words descended upon him. I couldn't help but I didn't mention it, but we ended up sitting on opposite ends of the couch in the living room once more, just like the last time. At one point, the gap between us seemed insurmountable, without Sebastian stated abruptly, breaking the pattern. I've known you for so long, and I'm falling into the same mistakes. You've always been this dependable person in my life, someone I could rely on, who cared, and at some point that become this, I forcefully swallowed my chest. Tensing up as he said, I love you too, Sebastian, but this is risky, NG, his eyes falling to his palms. I didn't want to disrupt things, but I also didn't want to act as though this didn't happen. The room was extremely silent. I needed to find the appropriate words to lighten the burden of our unsaid feelings, so I wanted to say something. However, nothing arrived. Therefore I should leave, he remarked at last, his voice thick with Sebastian's unexpected interruption, while standing up, made me realize that I couldn't stay here. As he turned, I stood there, my pulse pounding, knowing that if it means feeling this way and helpless to change it, then so be it. I muttered, Leave, wait, in a stronger tone than I meant, and he froze his hand. On the eye blurted out, Doorknob, what do I not want you to go? He turned slowly, his eyes wide. I don't know what to do about this either, but I don't want you to leave, he said. You mean that I tightened my throat and nodded in surprise? Yes, I pay attention. To the air between us crackled with unspoken possibilities as the room changed. Made a tentative stride in my direction, looking into my eyes for approval and assurance that I didn't wish to cause trouble. Difficult, he added quietly, but being here, in your presence, is, however, even though I knew it shouldn't. His comments caused my resolve to weaken, and I closed. He threaded his fingers with mine as we were separated, and both of our touches tended to be affirmative and certain. My voice was almost heard as I said, We're playing with fire. Perhaps he mumbled something feeble, His lips are being pulled by a smile, yet it doesn't feel incorrect to me that our haze of hushed admissions and stolen moments ensued. We didn't truly violate any boundaries yet as dawn broke, our bond grew stronger, and something that was hard to ignore became apparent. His head resting against my shoulder while the soft light filled the living room. Neither of us said anything, but the quiet felt cozy, like a truce, even though I knew we couldn't maintain it. Walking on this line without breaking it, but for the time being, I allowed myself to lean into it with the knowledge that the real world will soon arrive. Sebastian said, after a lengthy pause, "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to be honest with, I'm still unsure, but I genuinely like you and don't want to keep it a secret any longer. How you feel about it, but I truly need to let this out." And the tension instantly changed in that moment. I experienced a rush of exhilaration after Sebastian revealed that he had placed himself in such a precarious situation. My sentiments, Sebastian. I'm so glad you're telling me this at last. I've been feeling the same way lately, and you really appeal to me. You're such a bright, attractive, and handsome young man that it's incredibly exciting, but I was cut off when he grabbed me and planted a kiss on me. Much more sensitive this time, and I thought it was a comfort for both of us. After a minute of intense kissing, he grasped me in areas I'd loved to feel his touch, and I let him kiss me more deeply. Everything happened, and the age gap didn't matter, because this was true love. Now that his shirt on the floor, I could at last appreciate his toned upper body at one. He performed the thing as soon as he finished kissing me and slid down, and while I won't go into specifics, I can tell you that it was his lips were so smooth and masculine that they drove me insane. From bad to worse, we did everything you can think of, and when we were both done, we laid in each other's arms. Sebastian must have been tired since it didn't take him long to fall asleep, and a moment later, I also fell asleep. Long shadows were cast across the living room a few hours later as the light rose higher, and the weight of what we'd Sebastian moved slightly as he rested over us, keeping his head on my. I let myself bask in the warmth of his presence for a moment on his shoulder. The way his fingers lightly touched mine was silent, but it wasn't void. Rather, it was heavy with the consequences of what after a while, Sebastian woke up, raising his head and rubbing his eyes. "I should leave him," murmured in a tired voice, and I nodded before Daniel returned. It was probably best that he stood there, even though he knew he was correct, and felt the pain of our approaching separation. He made my chest tense by stretching, the light catching his face. There was a vulnerability in his. He paused as though he wanted to say something, but his face was one of longing and remorse that reflected mine. Something, but all he did was grin sadly at me and say thank you. Quietly. I stood there as well, running a hand through my hair, not pushing anyone away. Perfect words, Sebastian. I'm not sure where to start. We continue from here, but I know that I care more about you than I do about losing you. Probably ought to, but we can't ignore this much longer. I know I feel the same way about the air because he nodded and his eyes were sparkling with unshed tears. Every unspoken phrase that hung in the room between us was heated, and at last he stepped. He glanced back at me as he paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and said, "I'll call you." "Okay," I responded. "Take care of yourself, you two," he said, scarcely raising his voice beyond a whisper, before disappearing into the morning light. The days that followed were extremely painful. And Sebastian's absence was SS in his absence that I hadn't expected when Daniel came home. I tried to act normal, ignorant to the tension that was simmering beneath the surface, to suppress the feelings that sprang up every time I thought about Sebastian. But it wasn't always simple. My heart leaped as my phone buzzed, thinking it was him. But he didn't call, and our quiet grew increasingly eerie. As time went on, a week later, Sebastian returned to my door, CH with his hand stuffed in his pockets and his eyes meeting without any pretense or explanations. Mine with such resolve that I was unable to keep my distance. He said, his steady but vulnerable voice. I tried, but I was unable to do so, so I moved aside to let him in without a word. He passed me by, his presence occupying the room as though he had never. We were left standing in the corridor with the weight of our unsaid emotions bearing down on us. I considered everything he said as he turned to face me, thinking about you and us. That it is convoluted and messy, but I also know that I can't act as though I no longer feel this way, since his remarks caused a rift in me, and I experienced a surge of emotions that I was unable to control. Sebastian began, but interrupted me. I'm not asking for anything, he stated in a hurry. I simply wanted to let you know that I don't want to conceal anything. Anne's leaving. The idea of him leaving was intolerable, so I closed the distance between us before I could stop myself. As soon as my hands touched his face, I drew him into a frantic, and he responded right away, his arms encircling me as though he were worried that I could vanish. And we broke, I don't know, but we were both breathing heavily and pressing our foreheads together. I acknowledged that my voice was shaking. But I don't want to lose you, he said in a stern voice. You won't. We'll work things out together over the next few months. Sebastian and I had to do a delicate balancing act in which we managed our emotions while maintaining our. It wasn't easy to keep the link secret from Daniel and the rest of the world. There were times when doubt and fear of questioning surfaced. Regardless of whether we were doing morally, we held on to one another and found comfort in our relationship. Forged, we were aware that the truth would ultimately surface and that it couldn't stay forever. However, for the time being, we permitted ourselves to live in the interim while enjoying our new life consisted of stolen moments and private admissions. And as I gazed at Sebastian, his smile brightened. Up the room, I was positive that no matter what obstacles we faced, we would confront them collectively, because some relationships are too strong to overlook, too profound to reject, and whatever this